Lucas, a successful young entrepreneur, had fallen deeply in love with Clara. For months, they had been seeing each other, and things were getting serious. Clara had finally invited him to meet her parents, something Lucas knew was inevitable but dreaded. He wasn't nervous because he lacked confidence. Far from it. His anxiety stemmed from the secret he had kept from Clara all along. He was wealthy, extraordinarily wealthy, and now, the thought of her family treating him differently because of his money made him uneasy. That morning, as Lucas stood in front of his mirror, he made an impulsive decision. He would disguise himself as someone of modest means, a man who didn't flaunt his success. He pulled out an old pair of jeans, worn sneakers, and a faded t-shirt, items he hadn't worn in years. His usual polished appearance was replaced with something far more humble, looking at himself one last time. Before heading out, Lucas smirked nervously. "Let's see how they treat me now." Clara, unaware of Lucas's plan, greeted him at the door with her usual warmth and affection. She didn't seem to mind his casual look. After all, she had always cared for him, not his wealth. But as they stepped into the living room, her parents' reaction was less welcoming. Her father, Roberto, a stern man with a traditional mindset, immediately narrowed his eyes as he took in Lucas's appearance. Her mother, Maria, offered a polite but tight-lipped smile. The tension was subtle, but Lucas felt it. Seated around the modest wooden table, Lucas could feel Roberto's gaze burning into him. "So, Lucas, Clara says you're in business," Roberto began, his tone carrying a hint of suspicion. Lucas nodded, trying to stay calm under the scrutiny. "Yes, I do some freelance work, here and there," he replied, deliberately vague. He could sense Roberto's disapproval as the man's eyes flickered between his clothes and Clara. Maria, trying to ease the tension, chimed in, "And how long have you two been together?" Lucas smiled at Clara, genuinely touched by how much he cared for her. "Almost a year now," he said. Clara squeezed his hand under the table, unaware of the undercurrents swirling in the room. As the meal progressed, Roberto's probing questions continued. "Do you have any plans for the future? A stable career, perhaps?" The words were sharp, and Lucas realized this was more than just curiosity. It was a test. He was being judged, not as Clara's boyfriend, but as someone seemingly beneath her status. Lucas maintained his calm, but the strain of the situation was starting to weigh on him. He hadn't expected such harsh judgment from the very beginning. Little did he know, things were about to take an unexpected turn. As the tension simmered, a knock at the door echoed through the small house. The knock at the door startled everyone. Clara's mother, Maria, quickly stood up, wiping her hands on her apron before heading to answer it. Lucas exchanged a curious glance with Clara, but neither of them could have predicted what was about to happen. The door opened, revealing a man in a sharp suit, holding a briefcase. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. Maria, taken aback, called for Roberto to join her. "Roberto, there's a man here asking for Lucas," she said, confusion in her voice. Lucas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This was not part of his plan. He had gone to great lengths to hide his wealth today, so who could possibly be looking for him here, and in such a formal manner? Roberto approached the door, his face a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The man introduced himself briefly before turning his attention directly to Lucas, who was still seated at the table. "Mr. Lucas Silva," the man began, "I'm from your corporate office. I was instructed to deliver these important documents to you immediately." The room fell into a stunned silence. Clara's eyes widened, and Roberto's face hardened as he stared at Lucas. Lucas felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead. He had no choice but to stand and address the situation. I think there's been a mistake," Lucas stammered, trying to salvage the situation. "I wasn't expecting anything today," but the man in the suit was relentless. "I apologize for the intrusion, sir, but these contracts require your urgent attention. We were unable to reach you by phone, so we were given this address." The formality of the situation was impossible to ignore, and Lucas's attempt to keep up his disguise was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Roberto crossed his arms, his gaze now icy. "What is this about, Lucas? You work for a company?" The sharpness in his tone made it clear that he expected answers. Lucas sighed heavily. The carefully constructed facade he had built for the day was disintegrating. "It's complicated," he began, but before he could continue, Clara stood up, clearly confused and a little hurt. "Lucas, what's going on? You said you did freelance work. Why is someone from a corporate office here?" The weight of the situation pressed down on Lucas. He had never intended to reveal his wealth in such a dramatic way, especially not in front of Clara's family like this. But now, the truth was teetering on the edge of revelation, and there was no turning back. Lucas looked at Clara, then at her parents. He knew he had to explain himself, but before he could speak, Roberto cut in, his voice cold. "I think we deserve to know who you really are, Lucas." And just like that, Lucas knew the simple lunch he had envisioned had turned into a reckoning, one that could either break or solidify his relationship with Clara and her family. But as he prepared to explain, another surprise was about to unfold, one that would change the entire dynamic in an instant. Lucas stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. His carefully crafted plan had backfired in the most unexpected way. Clara's eyes, usually full of warmth and trust, now held confusion and concern. Roberto was watching him intently, arms crossed, waiting for an explanation. Maria, still standing by the door, seemed torn between curiosity and unease. "I didn't mean for it to come out like this," Lucas started, glancing nervously at Clara. "The truth is, I haven't been entirely honest about who I am." Clara frowned, taking a step back. "Lucas, what are you saying?" Lucas took a deep breath. There was no way out now. He had to come clean. "I'm not just a freelancer. I own a company, a successful one. In fact, I'm much wealthier than I've let on." Roberto's eyebrows shot up in surprise, though his expression remained guarded. Clara's mouth opened slightly, as if she were about to say something, but the words didn't come. Maria, watching from the sidelines, finally spoke. "Why would you hide that, Lucas? Why pretend to be someone else?" Lucas felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "Because I didn't want to be judged for my money," he admitted, his voice softer now. "I've had experiences in the past where people treated me differently once they knew how wealthy I was. They saw me as something I'm not, and with Clara, I didn't want that. I wanted her, and all of you, to see me for who I am. Just Lucas." The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick in the air. Clara's face softened slightly, though her confusion was still evident. "Lucas, I would never care about your money, but why did you feel the need to lie? Did you think I'd treat you differently?" Lucas shook his head, his eyes pleading with hers. "No, not you, Clara, but I wasn't sure how your parents would react. I didn't want to risk being seen as someone who's just throwing money around. I wanted to prove that I'm more than just a rich guy." Roberto finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We don't care about money, Lucas. What we care about is honesty. We want to know that the man dating our daughter is someone who can be trusted, and right now, it's hard to trust someone who felt the need to hide who they are." Lucas felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He hadn't considered how deeply his deception would affect Clara's family. He looked at Clara, hoping to find forgiveness in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Clara, I never meant to hurt you or your family. I thought I was doing the right thing." Clara took a step closer to him, her expression softening. "I understand why you did it, but you should have trusted me. Lucas, we could have dealt with this together." Just as the moment seemed to be settling, the man in the suit, who had been standing quietly by the door, suddenly cleared his throat. "Mr. Silva, I apologize for the interruption, but there is one more urgent matter to address." Everyone turned their attention to him, and Lucas felt his stomach drop. "What now?" he thought, bracing for another complication. The man opened his briefcase and pulled out a small stack of papers. "There's an issue with one of your overseas investments. It requires your immediate attention." Lucas's face paled. The timing couldn't have been worse. He looked at Clara, then back at the man, and realized the situation was spiraling further out of control, and just when it seemed like things couldn't get more complicated, Roberto asked the question that no one had anticipated. "What kind of investments are we talking about?" The room went quiet again as Roberto's question hung in the air. Lucas felt like he was walking on a tightrope, each step more precarious than the last. Clara looked at him, her eyes searching for answers, while her parents were clearly growing more skeptical. Lucas knew this was another moment of truth, one that could deepen their mistrust if not handled carefully. Lucas swallowed hard before responding. "I have investments in various industries, including tech and real estate," he explained cautiously. "I've worked hard to build something sustainable, but sometimes things don't go as planned." He glanced at the man in the suit, whose serious expression made it clear that this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. Roberto's brow furrowed. "And now you have a problem with one of these investments?" "What kind of problem?" Lucas felt a surge of frustration. He didn't want to go into detail here, in front of Clara's family, but it was clear Roberto wasn't going to let this slide. He had no choice but to explain. "There's an issue with a real estate project overseas. A deal I was working on hit a snag, and it needs my immediate attention." Clara stepped forward, worry etched across her face. "Lucas, why didn't you tell me any of this? I had no idea you were dealing with something this big." Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to overwhelm you. I thought I could handle it on my own, but it's more complicated than I expected." Roberto exchanged a glance with Maria, who remained silent but watchful. "Lucas, Roberto began, his tone still sharp. I understand that. Business can be complicated, but what concerns me is the fact that you've been hiding so much from us, from Clara. How can we trust someone who hasn't been upfront from the start? Lucas knew that this was the heart of the issue. It wasn't about his money or his investments, it was about trust, and he had broken that with his deception. You're right, Lucas admitted quietly, feeling the weight of his own mistakes. I should have been honest from the beginning, but I hope you understand that my intentions were never to deceive. I just wanted to be seen for who I really am, not for my wealth. Clara softened at his words, but Roberto remained unconvinced. Who you are is someone who hides behind lies. Lucas, I don't know what kind of future you can offer Clara if this is how you handle things. Lucas felt the blow of Roberto's words deeply, but before he could respond, the man in the suit interrupted. Once more, I apologize again, but this matter can't wait. Mr. Silva, I need your signature on these documents to resolve the issue. Lucas looked at the papers the man was holding and then at Clara. He could see the hurt in her eyes, and he knew that if he left now to deal with his business, it might break the fragile bond they had left. But before Lucas could make a decision, Clara spoke up, her voice steady despite the tension. Dad, I think that's enough. Everyone turned to look at her. Lucas made a mistake, but I know he cares about me, and I care about him. We'll figure this out together. Her words, filled with both love and strength, took Lucas by surprise. Clara wasn't just defending him. She was standing by him, despite everything. It was more than he could have hoped for in that moment. Roberto stared at his daughter for a long moment before sighing, the fight seeming to drain out of him. Clara, this is your life. If you believe in Lucas, then I won't stand in your way, but remember, trust is hard to rebuild once it's broken. Clara nodded, understanding the gravity of her father's words. She turned to Lucas and offered him a small, reassuring smile. We'll get through this, she whispered. Lucas, feeling a mixture of relief and gratitude, nodded back, but as he reached for the documents, ready to handle the business crisis, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger challenge, one that would test both his love for Clara and his ability to navigate the consequences of his own choices. As Lucas signed the documents and handed them back to the man in the suit, a sense of unease settled over the room. The business issue was temporarily resolved, but the tension between Lucas and Clara's family lingered like a dark cloud. The man in the suit quietly excused himself, leaving the house, but the echoes of his presence remained. Lucas knew that even though the paperwork was done, the real work had just begun, repairing the damage caused by his deception. Clara stood next to him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. We'll talk more later, she said softly, signaling that there were still unresolved feelings between them. Lucas nodded, grateful that she hadn't walked away from him yet. Roberto, on the other hand, wasn't finished. Lucas, I respect that you're trying to fix things now, he began, his voice heavy with disappointment, but I have to wonder, if you can hide something this big, what else are you hiding? How can we trust that there isn't more we don't know? Lucas took a deep breath. He had expected this question, but it still stung. There's nothing else, he said firmly. I made a mistake, and I regret not being upfront about my wealth. But I swear to you, I've told Clara everything now. There are no more secrets. Roberto's eyes narrowed as he weighed Lucas's words. That's easy to say now, he muttered. Trust is earned. Lucas, you'll have to work hard to gain mine. Maria, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. Trust can be rebuilt, she said gently, looking at her husband, but it takes time. I think what's important now is how Lucas handles things from here on out. Clara nodded in agreement, and Lucas felt a flicker of hope. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove myself, Lucas said earnestly, looking directly at Roberto. I love Clara, and I'm committed to being honest with her, and with all of you, from now on. Roberto studied Lucas for a long moment before speaking. We'll see, he said quietly, his tone making it clear that this wasn't an instant forgiveness. Lucas would have to prove himself through actions, not just words. The awkwardness in the room began to lift, if only slightly, as the conversation shifted. Maria invited everyone to sit back down and finish the meal, trying to restore some sense of normalcy. As they ate, the conversations remained polite but shallow, with everyone clearly still processing the day's events. After lunch, Lucas and Clara excused themselves to take a walk outside. They strolled through the quiet streets, the autumn air cool against their skin. Clara had been quiet since they left the house, and Lucas knew she was deep in thought. Finally, she turned to him, her expression serious. Lucas, I'm still trying to understand why you felt the need to hide something like this from me. I get that you didn't want to be judged, but don't you trust me? Lucas stopped walking and faced her, his heart heavy. Clara, I trust you more than anyone, he said. Sincerely, but I've been burned before. People have used me for my money, and I didn't want that to happen with us. I didn't want you to see me as just a rich guy. Clara shook her head, her frustration evident. I don't care about your money, Lucas, I care about you. But now, I feel like I've been living in a different reality. Like I didn't know who you really were. Lucas reached for her hands, holding them tightly. You do know me, Clara, everything. We've shared, everything we've been through. That was real. My money doesn't change who I am, and it doesn't change how I feel about you. Clara looked into his eyes, her own filled with a mixture of emotions, hurt, confusion, and love. I believe you, she said softly, but it's going to take time for me to fully trust you again. You need to be patient with me. Lucas nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. I'll wait as long as it takes, he promised. I'll do whatever I can to show you that you can trust me. Clara sighed, her expression softening. I want to move forward with you, Lucas, but no more secrets, okay? We face everything together from now on. Lucas smiled, a wave of relief washing over him. No more secrets, he agreed. From now on, everything is out in the open. As they continued their walk, hand in hand, Lucas knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since the disastrous lunch began, he felt like they were on the right track. They had faced the worst of it, and now, with Clara by his side, he was ready to make things right. As the days passed, Lucas focused on one thing: rebuilding Clara's trust. He knew that winning over her father, Roberto, would take time, but his primary concern was Clara. He wanted her to see that he was serious about their future and that the mistakes he had made wouldn't define their relationship. The first step was transparency. Lucas opened up about his business, his investments, and the pressures that came with managing his wealth. For the first time, Clara began to understand the full extent of his responsibilities and the weight he carried. She listened patiently, though it was clear she was still processing everything. They spent long hours talking about the life Lucas had kept hidden, his successes, his failures, and most importantly, his fears. One evening, as they sat together in Clara's small apartment, Lucas finally shared the story of why he had been so protective of his wealth. A few years ago, I was engaged to someone else, he admitted quietly, his gaze fixed on the floor. Clara's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. She was beautiful, smart, everything I thought I wanted, but as time went on, I realized she was more interested in my money than in me. Clara shifted in her seat, sensing how difficult this was for Lucas. What happened? She asked gently. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. I found out she was secretly draining my accounts. She was planning to leave once she had enough saved up. When I confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. She just said that I had more than enough money and that she deserved some of it. After that, I swore I'd never let anyone close enough to hurt me like that again. Clara's heart ached for him. She could see the pain in his eyes, the lingering scars from that betrayal. I'm so sorry, Lucas, she whispered, taking his hand in hers. But I'm not her. I would never do that to you. Lucas nodded, squeezing her hand. I know that now, he said softly, but back then, it felt safer to keep my wealth a secret. I didn't want to be vulnerable again, but with you, I should have been honest from the start. Clara leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder. We all have things we're afraid of, she murmured, but if we're going to build a life together, we have to face those fears, not hide from them. Her words struck Lucas deeply. He realized that by trying to protect himself, he had almost lost the one person who truly mattered. He vowed, then and there, to never let fear dictate his actions again. Meanwhile, Clara's relationship with her parents remained tense. Roberto, though polite, was still distant, clearly unsure about Lucas. Maria, on the other hand, had warmed up to him slightly. She saw the effort Lucas was making to mend things with Clara and appreciated his honesty, but she also knew it would take time for Roberto to come around. A few weeks later, Lucas made a bold decision. He invited Clara's parents to dinner at one of the upscale restaurants he owned, hoping that this gesture would demonstrate his seriousness and allow them to see a different side of him. Clara was hesitant at first, worried that it might feel like Lucas was flaunting his wealth, but he assured her that this wasn't about showing off. It was about being honest and open with her family. The night of the dinner arrived, and Lucas went all out to ensure that everything went perfectly. The restaurant was elegant but welcoming, the atmosphere warm and inviting. Roberto and Maria arrived, looking slightly uncomfortable at first, but they quickly relaxed once they saw the care Lucas had put into the evening. Throughout the meal, Lucas engaged Roberto in conversation, discussing everything from business to family values. He shared more about his life, not just the wealth but the struggles and sacrifices that came with it. Roberto listened carefully, and though he didn't say much, Lucas could sense that the older man was beginning to see him in a new light. By the end of the evening, there was a noticeable shift in the dynamic. As they said their goodbyes, Roberto shook Lucas's hand firmly, his expression softening. "I appreciate you making the effort tonight," Roberto said gruffly, though there was a hint of warmth in his tone. "It's clear you care about my daughter, and that's what matters most to me." Lucas felt a wave of relief. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was a step in the right direction. Later, as Lucas and Clara walked back to his car, she smiled up at him. "You did it," she said, her eyes shining with pride. Lucas chuckled, wrapping an arm around her. "We did it," he corrected, feeling more hopeful than he had in weeks. For the first time since the disastrous lunch, it felt like things were finally starting to fall into place. With the tension between Lucas and Clara's family slowly easing, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The scars of their earlier struggles hadn't entirely faded, but they were healing. Lucas felt a renewed sense of hope, both in his relationship with Clara and in his ability to prove himself to Roberto. Still, as the days went on, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beneath the surface, an unease he couldn't quite place. One evening, as they sat on the couch in Lucas's apartment, Clara looked at him thoughtfully. "I'm proud of how hard you've been working to make things right with my family," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "But there's something I've been thinking about." Lucas turned to face her, intrigued. "What is it?" Clara hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. "You've been so focused on proving yourself to my dad and making sure I trust you again, and I do. I trust you. But I can tell something is still bothering you. It's like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop." Lucas frowned slightly, surprised by how perceptive Clara was. She was right. He had been feeling on edge, though he hadn't realized how obvious it was. "I guess I'm still worried," he admitted quietly. "Things are going well now, but I keep thinking, what if something else goes wrong?" Clara moved closer, her expression softening. "Lucas, you can't keep living like that. We've made it through the worst of it. You've earned my trust back, and my dad is starting to see who you really are. Things are getting better." Lucas nodded, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. "I know," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty, "but I don't want to mess this up again. What if I do something wrong, and everything falls apart?" Clara reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not going to mess this up," she said firmly. "We've already faced one of the hardest challenges we could, and we're stronger because of it. You need to stop doubting yourself." Her words were comforting, but Lucas couldn't help but feel like there was more to it. His wealth had always been both a blessing and a curse, and he knew from experience that it could attract problems he didn't anticipate. "I just feel like sometimes, no matter how hard I try to keep my life balanced, something from my past or business might come back to haunt me," he confessed. Clara leaned in closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "Whatever happens, we'll deal with it together. You don't have to carry everything on your own anymore." Lucas smiled at her, grateful for her support, but even as they sat in the quiet comfort of the moment, he couldn't shake the sense of impending trouble. That trouble came sooner than expected. The next morning, Lucas was in his office, going over some financial reports, when his phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from an old business associate he hadn't spoken to in months. The message was brief but alarming. "We need to talk. Urgent. Call me back ASAP." Lucas stared at the message, his heart sinking. He hadn't heard from this particular associate since a deal they had worked on together years ago, one that had ended with some tension but was supposedly resolved. He debated whether to call back right away or to ignore it for the time being. His instinct told him this wasn't something he could afford to ignore. Reluctantly, Lucas dialed the number. On the other end, the voice of his former associate, Ricardo, was tense and hurried. "Lucas, I've been trying to reach you. Something's come up with that old investment we made in South America. It's not good." Lucas felt a cold dread settle over him. "What do you mean, not good?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's been a legal complication. The authorities are reopening the case on that land deal. They're looking into corruption charges, and your name's on the list of investors they're investigating." Lucas's blood ran cold. That deal had been years ago, and he had thought everything was legitimate. Now, it seemed like the past he feared so much was finally catching up with him. "Ricardo, are you serious?" Lucas asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "I had no idea anything shady was going on with that deal." I know, Ricardo said quickly, "but they're not going to care. Your name is attached to the project, and that means you're involved, whether you knew or not." Lucas's mind raced. He had worked hard to keep his business clean, to avoid getting dragged into any illegal dealings. How could this be happening now, just when he was starting to rebuild his life? "I'll need more information," Lucas said, his voice low but steady. "Send me everything you have on this. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." As he hung up the phone, Lucas sat back in his chair, the weight of the new problem crushing down on him. He couldn't tell Clara. Not yet, not when things were finally starting to get better. But he also knew he couldn't keep this from her forever. For the first time in weeks, Lucas felt truly scared. The life he had worked so hard to build, the love he had fought to protect, everything could come crashing down because of a mistake from years ago, and this time, he wasn't sure how to fix it. Lucas spent the next few days in a constant state of tension, torn between handling the looming legal issue and keeping Clara in the dark. He knew he couldn't hide it from her forever, but with everything they had just overcome, he couldn't bear the thought of dragging her into another storm. He worked late into the night, gathering documents, making calls to his legal team, and trying to get ahead of the situation before it spiraled out of control. The case, as Ricardo had explained, was complicated. The land deal in South America had been part of a large investment portfolio that Lucas and other business partners had entered into years ago. At the time, everything had seemed above board, but now allegations of corruption and bribery were surfacing, implicating several high-profile investors. Lucas, though unaware of any wrongdoing, was listed among those being investigated. His reputation, and possibly his fortune, was on the line. The pressure weighed heavily on him, and it wasn't long before Clara began to notice. One evening, as Lucas sat at his desk, staring blankly at the legal documents spread out in front of him, Clara approached from behind, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Lucas," she said softly, "you've been distant these last few days. Is something wrong?" Lucas stiffened, caught between the urge to protect her and the need to be honest. He had promised her no more secrets, but he also knew that the truth could shatter the fragile peace they had worked so hard to rebuild. Clara, sensing his hesitation, moved to sit beside him. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. You don't have to carry this alone." Her words hit him hard, and Lucas knew he couldn't hide it anymore. With a deep breath, he turned to her, his eyes filled with the weight of the situation. "There's something I need to tell you." Clara listened intently as Lucas explained the situation. The old land deal, the investigation, and the potential legal consequences. As he spoke, her expression shifted from concern to shock and then to quiet determination. "So, you're saying they could come after you, even though you didn't do anything wrong?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. Lucas nodded, feeling the gravity of her question. "Yeah, my name is on the list of investors, and if they find anything that ties me to this, I could lose everything. My business, my reputation, it's all at risk." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing the information. Then, to Lucas's surprise, she didn't react with fear or anger. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. "Lucas, I know you. I know you would never get involved in anything illegal. We'll fight this." Lucas felt a surge of relief at her support, but there was still a nagging doubt in his mind. "Clara, this could get really bad. If the investigation goes south, I could be dragged through the mud. I don't want to pull you into that." Clara's grip on his hand tightened. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "We'll face this together, just like we've faced everything else. You don't have to protect me from this." Lucas looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had expected her to be upset, maybe even distant, but instead, Clara was standing by him, ready to fight alongside him. It was a moment of clarity for Lucas, a reminder of why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. But just as Lucas was starting to feel hopeful again, the situation took a darker turn. The following day, Lucas received an official notice from the authorities, summoning him to answer questions related to the investigation. The letter was formal, cold, and full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. Lucas was being pulled into the heart of the investigation, and his every move would be scrutinized. He sat in his office, the letter clutched in his hands, as a cold dread settled over him. He had dealt with high-stakes business deals and corporate conflicts before, but this was different. This was his name, his reputation, his entire life on the line. Clara, who had come to check on him, found him sitting at his desk, staring blankly at the letter. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Without a word, Lucas handed her the letter, watching as her eyes scanned the page. When she finished reading, she looked up at him, her face pale but resolute. "You're going to have to face this head-on, Lucas. We'll get a lawyer. We'll fight it." Lucas nodded, but the fear in his chest was growing. What if it's not enough? What if they find something I didn't even know about? Clara stepped closer, her eyes fierce. "Then we'll deal with it. You're not alone in this. I'm with you." Her unwavering support was the only thing keeping Lucas from falling apart, but even as she stood by his side, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were going to get much worse before they got better. As the days passed, the investigation deepened. Lawyers were hired, meetings were held, and Lucas found himself caught in a whirlwind of legal battles, media scrutiny, and constant stress. Every time he opened his phone, there was another headline, another article speculating about his involvement in the scandal. The pressure was relentless, but through it all, Clara remained by his side, her quiet strength keeping him grounded. Even when the world seemed to be closing in around them, she refused to let him face it alone, and yet, despite their best efforts, Lucas knew that the outcome was out of their hands. All they could do was wait, and hope that the truth would be enough to save them. As the investigation progressed, Lucas found himself pulled deeper into a web of complications. The media had caught wind of the case, and within days, his name was splashed across headlines. Phrases like corruption scandal and luxury businessman under scrutiny became associated with his identity, threatening to undo everything he had worked for. The pressure was suffocating. Clara tried to shield him from the worst of it, but Lucas couldn't escape the relentless phone calls from lawyers, questions from the media, and the growing unease from his business partners. His company, once a beacon of success, was now at risk of collapsing under the weight of the accusations. One evening, as Lucas sat at the dinner table with Clara, he could barely touch his food. The anxiety gnawing at him made it hard to think about anything else. "It's only getting worse," he muttered, his voice strained. "The media's not letting up, my reputation is in shambles, and the investigation hasn't even concluded." Clara reached across the table, gently taking his hand. "We'll get through this, Lucas," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You have a strong legal team, and we know the truth. That's what matters." But Lucas could see the toll it was taking on her, too. Clara had been his rock, offering unwavering support through each setback, but even her optimism was beginning to show cracks. The stress was palpable, hanging over them like a dark cloud. That night, after Clara had gone to bed, Lucas stayed up late, pacing the living room, his mind racing. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown. What if the investigation turned up something unexpected? What if there were details he had missed? The fear of losing everything, the company, Clara, his entire life, kept him awake long after midnight. The following day, Lucas received a call from his lead attorney, Daniel, who had been handling the case with precision and determination. "Lucas, we need to talk," Daniel said, his tone more serious than usual. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" "There's been a development in the investigation. The authorities have uncovered some financial discrepancies tied to the land deal," Daniel explained. "It looks like one of the lower-level partners was involved in bribes, and they're trying to trace the money. Unfortunately, your name is still associated with those transactions, even though we know you didn't authorize them." Lucas felt his stomach drop. "So what does that mean for me?" "It means they're going to dig deeper into your finances, your business operations, everything. We're doing our best to clear your name, but this is going to get more intense before it gets better," Daniel warned. Lucas hung up the phone, feeling the ground shift beneath him. The situation was spiraling out of control, and no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from the shady dealings, his past business choices were coming back to haunt him. Later that evening, Clara found him sitting on the balcony, staring blankly at the skyline. She approached quietly, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "Bad news?" she asked softly, already knowing the answer. Lucas nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "They found more connections. My name's tied to some illegal transactions. I didn't even know about them, but they're still there." Clara sat beside him, her eyes filled with concern. "Lucas, you're not alone in this. We'll keep fighting. No matter what happens, I'm with you." Lucas appreciated her words, but the weight of his fears was becoming overwhelming. "What if we don't win this, Clara? What if they decide I'm guilty by association? I could lose everything, the company, the life I've built." "And you," Clara shook her head, her grip on his hand tightening. "You're not going to lose me, Lucas. No matter what happens, I'm staying by your side. We'll figure this out together." Her words were a balm to his soul, but deep down, Lucas knew that the fight ahead would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. A week later, the situation took another sharp turn. One morning, as Lucas and Clara were getting ready for the day, Lucas's phone buzzed with a call from Daniel. His attorney's voice was tense. "Lucas, I need you to come to the office right away. There's been an update in the investigation." Lucas's heart raced. "What kind of update?" "It's complicated. I'll explain when you get here." With a sense of foreboding, Lucas quickly got dressed and told Clara he had to go. "I'll be back soon," he promised, though even as he said the words, he wasn't sure what awaited him. At Daniel's office, the atmosphere was heavy. When Lucas arrived, Daniel motioned for him to sit down. "There's been a new development," Daniel began. "The authorities have decided to press charges. They're claiming you were complicit in the bribery scheme." Lucas felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. "What?" "But I didn't know anything about it." "I know," Daniel said, his voice steady but grim. "We've been working hard to clear your name, but they're convinced you had some involvement. They're going to move forward with formal charges unless we can prove otherwise." Lucas's mind raced. The nightmare he had been trying to avoid was becoming a reality. If the charges stuck, he would not only lose his business, but his freedom could be at risk. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, could vanish in an instant. "What do we do now?" Lucas asked, his voice hoarse. "We fight," Daniel replied. "We gather every piece of evidence we can to prove your innocence. It's going to be a long battle, but it's not over yet." As Lucas left the office, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like never before, he knew that this was only the beginning of the most difficult chapter of his life. The fight to save his future, and his relationship with Clara, had truly begun. The days following the formal charges felt like a whirlwind for Lucas. The legal process moved quickly, much faster than he anticipated, and he found himself sitting in meetings with his lawyers, discussing strategies and gathering every piece of evidence they could find. His life had become a blur of legal paperwork, court filings, and constant phone calls with his defense team. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a man who was slowly unraveling under the weight of it all. Clara, true to her word, remained by his side. She attended every meeting she could, sat through endless discussions about legal tactics, and never wavered in her support, but Lucas could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The toll it was taking on her as well. He couldn't help but feel guilty for dragging her into this mess, even though she insisted that they were in it together. One night, as they sat together on the couch, Lucas turned to her, his expression heavy. "Clara, I'm sorry, this isn't the life I wanted for us. You don't deserve to be going through this." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with both love and frustration. "Lucas, stop saying that. I chose to be here with you. I'm not just going to walk away because things got hard. We'll get through this, but you have to stop blaming yourself for everything." Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just hate that I put you in this position. You deserve better." Clara leaned closer, her voice soft but firm. "What I deserve is a life with the man I love, and that's you. We'll face this together, no matter what happens." Her words were a comfort, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The legal battle was fierce. The prosecution was relentless, presenting evidence that painted Lucas as complicit in the bribery scheme. Even though he had no direct involvement, they pointed to financial records, emails, and business transactions that, on the surface, seemed to implicate him. Lucas's defense team worked tirelessly to counter these claims, but the case was complicated. Proving his innocence wasn't as simple as showing that he hadn't signed off on the deals. His name was tied to the project, and that alone was enough to cast suspicion on him. The media frenzy only made things worse. Every day, new headlines appeared, speculating about Lucas's role in the scandal. His business partners began to distance themselves, fearing that the negative press would affect their own reputations. Lucas's once thriving company was now on the brink of collapse, and investors were pulling out at an alarming rate. It felt like his entire world was crumbling around him. One afternoon, as Lucas sat in his lawyer's office, Daniel gave him the latest update on the case. "We're making progress," Daniel said, though his tone was cautious. "We've uncovered some documents that show one of your former partners, Eduardo, may have been the one orchestrating the bribery, but it's still not enough to clear you completely. We need more concrete evidence." Lucas felt a surge of anger at the mention of Eduardo's name. He had worked with Eduardo for years, trusting him to handle certain aspects of the business. If Eduardo had been involved in illegal activities, it explained a lot, but it didn't ease the frustration of being caught in the crossfire. "What can we do next?" Lucas asked, his voice tense. "We'll keep digging," Daniel assured him, "but it's going to take time, and in the meantime, you need to be prepared for the worst. The prosecution isn't going to let this go easily." Lucas nodded, though the reality of Daniel's words weighed heavily on him. He was running out of time, and the chances of clearing his name were growing slimmer by the day. That evening, Lucas and Clara sat in silence, the weight of everything between them. The stress was palpable, and for the first time, Lucas could see the cracks forming in their relationship. Clara was still there, still supportive, but the strain of the situation was taking its toll. "Do you ever wonder if it would have been easier if I just stayed out of all this?" Lucas asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. Clara turned to him, her expression pained. "Don't say that, Lucas. I know this is hard, but you can't just give up. We'll get through it." Lucas sighed, feeling the exhaustion in every part of his body. "I'm not giving up, Clara. I don't know how much more I can take." Clara reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're stronger than you think, and I'm not going anywhere." Her words brought him some comfort, but Lucas knew the road ahead was long, and the outcome was far from certain. As the days turned into weeks, the case moved closer to trial. Lucas's legal team had found more evidence linking Eduardo to the bribery scheme, but the prosecution was still determined to hold Lucas accountable. The court date loomed, and with each passing day, the pressure mounted. Lucas tried to stay focused, to keep his mind on the fight ahead, but the constant stress was wearing him down. Clara, too, was struggling. Though she did her best to hide it, Lucas could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she carried the weight of his burdens along with her own. One night, as they lay in bed, Clara finally spoke the words that had been lingering in the air for weeks. "Lucas, I love you, but this is tearing us apart." Lucas's heart clenched at her words. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it out loud was a different kind of pain. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, Clara." Clara turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm not asking you to be sorry. I just need to know that we're going to make it through this, that we're still going to be okay." Lucas reached for her, pulling her close. "We will," he promised, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "I'm not giving up on us." Clara buried her face in his chest, and Lucas held her tightly, hoping that his words would be enough to keep them both going. But deep down, he knew that the strain of the legal battle, the media attention, and the constant uncertainty was pushing them to the breaking point. The fight to clear his name was far from over, but Lucas was starting to realize that the cost might be more than he ever imagined. The day of the trial had finally arrived, and Lucas stood in front of the courthouse, his heart pounding. The media was out in full force, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions from every angle. His lawyer, Daniel, stood beside him, a calm presence amidst the chaos. Clara was there too, her hand gripping his tightly, offering silent support. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but serious. Lucas took a deep breath, nodding, "As ready as I'll ever be." The weight of the moment pressed down on him as they entered the courthouse, moving through the throngs of people who had come to witness the trial. Lucas felt the eyes of the world on him, every glance a reminder of the stakes. His future, his freedom, his entire life was on the line. He glanced at Clara, who gave him a small, reassuring smile. It gave him strength, but he couldn't shake the fear gnawing at his gut. The trial began with opening statements, the prosecution painting Lucas as a wealthy businessman who had used his power and influence to profit from illegal activities. Their narrative was damning, making it seem like Lucas had been at the heart of the bribery scheme all along. Lucas felt his pulse quicken as the prosecutor laid out the case, emphasizing the financial records that linked him to the corrupt deals. But when Daniel stood to deliver Lucas's defense, his voice was clear and confident. "My client, Lucas Silva, is not a criminal," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "He's a man who trusted his business partners, who believed in the legitimacy of the deals he was involved in. The real culprit is Eduardo Alves, a man who used Lucas's trust to further his own corrupt agenda." Lucas watched as Daniel skillfully began to dismantle the prosecution's case, presenting evidence that linked Eduardo to the bribery, emails showing how Eduardo had orchestrated the deals without Lucas's knowledge. But even with the mounting evidence, the prosecution was relentless. They questioned every detail, every transaction, painting a picture of a man who should have known better, a man who was ultimately responsible for what happened under his watch. The trial stretched on for days, with witness after witness called to the stand. Some were former employees who had worked on the South American project. Others were legal experts brought in to analyze the financial records. Lucas felt the tension in the courtroom rise with each testimony, his fate hanging on every word. One of the most critical moments came when Eduardo himself was called to testify. Lucas watched as his former business partner walked to the witness stand, his face pale but composed. Eduardo had been forced to cooperate with the authorities after being caught in his own web of lies. But Lucas didn't trust him, not after everything that had happened. As Eduardo took the stand, Lucas's lawyer began questioning him about the land deal and the bribery. At first, Eduardo was evasive, trying to downplay his involvement, but Daniel was relentless, pressing him harder and harder until Eduardo finally cracked. "Yes, I was involved in the bribery," Eduardo admitted, his voice tense, but Lucas didn't know anything about it. "I kept him out of the loop because I knew he wouldn't approve." A murmur swept through the courtroom as Eduardo's confession echoed in the air. Lucas felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the prosecution would still try to hold him accountable for not knowing what was happening within his own company. When the prosecution cross-examined Eduardo, they focused on Lucas's role as the head of the company. As CEO, it was Mr. Silva's responsibility to know what was happening under his leadership, the prosecutor said sharply. "Are you saying he had no idea that millions of dollars were being funneled through illegal channels?" Eduardo hesitated, glancing briefly at Lucas before responding. "Lucas trusted me. He wasn't involved in the day-to-day details of the deal. I took advantage of that trust. The prosecutor narrowed her eyes, clearly unsatisfied with Eduardo's answers, but she had no choice but to move on. As the trial neared its end, Lucas felt the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on him. The closing arguments from both sides were intense, each trying to sway the jury with their final words. The prosecution continued to emphasize Lucas's responsibility as the leader of his company, while Daniel focused on the betrayal of trust by Eduardo and Lucas's lack of direct involvement in the illegal activities. When the jury was finally dismissed to deliberate, Lucas felt the tension in the room rise to unbearable levels. The waiting was excruciating. Hours passed as the jury weighed the evidence, and every minute felt like a lifetime. Lucas sat in silence, Clara by his side, her hand resting gently on his arm. He could feel her strength, her belief in him, but even that wasn't enough to quiet the storm of fear inside him. After what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. Lucas's heart raced as the foreman stood, preparing to deliver the verdict. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on the man holding Lucas's future in his hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Lucas Silva." Lucas held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. "Not guilty." The words hit him like a wave, a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. He felt his knees go weak, and Clara immediately wrapped her arms around him, her face wet with tears of joy. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the tension finally breaking as people processed the verdict. Lucas turned to Daniel, who gave him a triumphant smile. "You did it," Daniel said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "You're free." But even as the relief washed over him, Lucas knew that this victory had come at a cost. His company was in shambles, his reputation had been tarnished, and the stress of the trial had pushed his relationship with Clara to the brink. Outside the courthouse, as they walked away from the media frenzy, Clara looked up at Lucas, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and exhaustion. "It's over," she said softly. Lucas nodded, though he knew that in many ways, the battle was just beginning. He had his freedom, but now he had to rebuild his life, his business, and his relationship with the woman he loved. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Lucas believed that they would make it through. Together, the trial was over, and Lucas had won his freedom, but the emotional and mental toll it had taken was undeniable. As the days passed, life slowly returned to something resembling normal, but nothing was quite the same. His business, once thriving, had been scarred by the ordeal. His reputation, though not entirely ruined, would take years to rebuild. Yet, Lucas knew that the most important thing he had managed to hold onto was his relationship with Clara. Clara stood by his side throughout it all. Even when things seemed hopeless, she had been his anchor, the reason he kept fighting when everything felt like it was falling apart. Now, as they sat on the porch of their new home, overlooking the quiet, peaceful view of the countryside, Lucas felt a rare moment of calm wash over him. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't made it through?" Clara asked softly, her hand resting on his. Lucas turned to her, a small smile playing on his lips. "I used to, but not anymore. We did make it through, and that's what matters." Clara smiled, her eyes reflecting a sense of peace that hadn't been there for months. The battle they had fought, both inside and outside the courtroom, had tested them in ways they never could have predicted, but it had also made them stronger. Lucas had made a decision after the trial. He was going to take a step back from the business world. At least for a while. The stress, the scandals, the constant pressure. It wasn't worth losing the things that really mattered. For now, he and Clara were focused on rebuilding their life together, one that wasn't driven by wealth or status but by simplicity, honesty, and love. In the months that followed the trial, Lucas found solace in small things, taking long walks with Clara, spending time with close friends, and slowly rebuilding his life on his own terms. His company, though still struggling, had loyal employees who were helping him put the pieces back together, and while the media eventually moved on to the next big scandal, Lucas knew that the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Lucas turned to Clara, his heart full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said quietly. "You've been my strength, even when I didn't deserve it." Clara smiled softly, leaning into him. "We've been through a lot, Lucas, but we made it because we faced it together, and that's how we're going to handle everything from now on, together." Lucas pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her love and the comfort of knowing that, despite everything they had been through, they had come out stronger. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Lucas no longer feared the unknown. He had learned to trust, to be honest, and most importantly, to never take the people he loved for granted, and with Clara by his side, he knew they could face anything.